It's okay. This is your moment. This is an incredible atmosphere, one that you generate everywhere you go now, and it just keeps getting bigger and bigger. How good does it feel?
There was a moment in Washington when tennis fans realized something had changed. People weren't walking toward the stadium simply because a tennis match was about to begin. They were walking toward it because Alex Eala was playing. Tickets were disappearing. Resale prices were climbing. Fans were searching across platforms just to find a seat. And inside the tournament itself, an extraordinary question was becoming impossible to ignore. Why was a player outside the world's top 10 creating the kind of demand usually reserved for the biggest names in tennis? Alex Eala wasn't the world number one. She wasn't a Grand Slam champion. She wasn't carrying years of WTA dominance behind her name. She was a 20-year-old Filipino player who had been steadily building something far more difficult to manufacture. A connection with the audience. And Washington may have been the moment that connection became impossible for the tennis world to overlook. Because this wasn't simply about one sold-out session. It was about what happened when thousands of people suddenly decided that watching Alex Eala in person was something they could not miss. And once that happened, the conversation around her changed completely. For years, professional tennis has followed a familiar formula. The rankings rise. The biggest names receive the biggest courts. The biggest stars attract the biggest crowds. And the audience usually follows the rankings. But Washington offered a different possibility. What if the audience starts deciding who the biggest attraction is before the rankings do? That is exactly what made the DC Open so fascinating. The tournament isn't one of the enormous Grand Slam events. Its main stadium is relatively intimate compared with the massive arenas used at the sport's biggest tournament. Under normal circumstances, that means a busy session can still feel manageable. But this time, something unusual happened. Fans who wanted to watch Eala discovered that getting inside wasn't going to be easy. Some couldn't find tickets through normal channels. Others began checking resale sites. And as demand increased, so did prices. Suddenly, watching one young Filipino player had become a valuable commodity. Think about how extraordinary that is. A WTA 500 tournament had become the center of attention because fans wanted to see one particular player. Not just because she was winning, but because people wanted to experience the atmosphere surrounding her. And that atmosphere had a very specific identity. Filipino flags. Filipino families. Filipino fans who had waited years for someone from their country to reach this level. People who might not normally spend an afternoon watching professional tennis were suddenly making plans around Alex Eala's schedule. That is the part of this story that statistics alone cannot explain. Alex wasn't simply attracting traditional tennis fans. She was bringing an entirely different emotional audience into the stadium. And Washington wasn't the first place where that began to happen. Her rise had already been noticed in other cities. Every time Eala stepped onto the court, another Filipino community seemed ready to rally behind her. The location changed, the opponent changed, the tournament changed, but the reaction remained remarkably similar. People wanted to see Alex, and then something even more interesting happened. Tournament officials began noticing the same pattern. According to comments attributed to Washington tournament chairman Mark Ein, a huge majority of ticket inquiries were centered around one question: when is Alex Eala playing? That question matters, because tournament popularity isn't measured only through social media. It isn't measured only through followers, and it certainly isn't measured only through rankings. For tournament organizers, one of the clearest measurements is much simpler. Will people actually buy a ticket to watch this player? In Washington, the answer was becoming increasingly obvious: yes. And that creates a fascinating problem for the traditional business model of tennis. Because if a player outside the top 10 can generate this kind of demand, what happens when her ranking catches up with her popularity? That's where this story becomes much bigger than Washington. Because Alex Eala isn't just building a winning record. She's building something every professional sport desperately wants: a loyal audience. And here's where things get even more interesting. The conversation wasn't limited to fans. Former professional players began discussing the same question: who is currently one of the biggest attractions in women's tennis? And suddenly, Eala's name was being placed in conversations with players who have spent years at the very top of the sport. That doesn't mean Alex has already achieved everything those champions have achieved. She hasn't. She still has a huge amount of work ahead of her. But popularity and accomplishment are not always the same thing. A player can have fewer trophies and still create an atmosphere that another player cannot. And that appears to be what Eala is doing. The rankings measure where you stand. The crowd measures how much people care. Right now, those two measurements are moving at different speeds. And that may be the most fascinating part of Alex Eala's rise. Her ranking tells one story. Her audience tells another. The second story may be moving faster. Because when fans start traveling, buying tickets, searching for resale seats and filling stadiums specifically to watch one player, tournament directors have to pay attention. This is how star power is born. Not from a marketing campaign. Not from a slogan. Not from someone simply declaring that a player is the next superstar. It happens when fans make the decision themselves. And Filipino fans have been making that decision again and again. There is an emotional reason for it. For Filipinos around the world, Eala represents something larger than a tennis result. She represents visibility. She represents possibility. And for many members of the Filipino diaspora, seeing one of their own compete against the best players in the world creates a feeling that is difficult to reproduce through ordinary sports coverage. That emotional connection has become part of the atmosphere whenever she plays. You can see it in the flags. You can hear it in the reactions. You can feel it when a difficult point suddenly turns into a celebration. And that support creates something every player dreams about: a home crowd. Even when the tournament is thousands of miles from the Philippines. That may be one of Eala's most unusual advantages. She can walk into another city and discover that the crowd already has a reason to care. But now comes the question that could define the next stage of her career. Was Washington a one-time phenomenon? Because one explosive tournament can always be explained away. Maybe the timing was perfect. Maybe the local Filipino community turned out in extraordinary numbers. Maybe the combination of Eala's recent results and the tournament schedule created the perfect storm. But what happens if it continues? What happens in Toronto? What happens in Cincinnati? And what happens when the US Open arrives? That is where this story becomes truly important. The US Open is not Washington. The scale is completely different. The stadiums are enormous. The media attention is relentless. The world's biggest players are there. And every major court becomes part of the global television picture. If Eala continues winning and continues generating this level of audience interest, tournament organizers will eventually face an interesting decision. Do they schedule matches purely according to rankings? Or do they also consider demand? Because historically, those two things have usually pointed in the same direction. The best-ranked players receive the biggest stages because they are expected to draw the biggest crowds. But what happens when a rising player begins generating more excitement than her ranking suggests? That is the situation Eala is creating. And it could become even more significant if she keeps defeating established names. Every major win strengthens her tennis resume. But it also strengthens her commercial value. Every upset creates another headline. Every headline introduces her to another audience. Every new audience creates more interest. And that interest brings more people into the stadium. It becomes a cycle. Win, attention, audience, more demand. And suddenly, the player who was once considered a promising young talent becomes one of the players everyone wants to see. But there is another side to becoming a major attraction. Pressure. Because once thousands of people buy tickets specifically to watch you, expectations change. They aren't simply coming to discover you anymore. They are coming expecting something. They expect the comeback. They expect the big point. They expect the emotional celebration. They expect another memorable performance. And every opponent knows it. Imagine walking onto the court against Alex Eala and seeing an entire section of the stadium covered in Philippine flags. You know exactly who the crowd wants to win. You know exactly where the emotional momentum is going. That doesn't win a tennis match by itself. But atmosphere matters. Confidence matters. And the ability to make an opponent feel that the entire environment is against them can become a psychological advantage. Eala still has to earn every point. She still has to serve, return, defend, attack, and close matches under pressure. But the environment around her is becoming part of the story. And that is why Washington may eventually be remembered as more than another tournament on her schedule. It may be remembered as a turning point. The moment people stopped asking whether Alex Eala could become a star someday, and started asking a different question: how big can this become? Because the signs are already there. Fans are paying attention. Communities are showing up. Tournament officials are noticing. Former professionals are discussing her drawing power. And the tennis world is beginning to understand that Eala's appeal cannot be explained by rankings alone. She has something that cannot be manufactured. A genuine connection with people. And those connections can last much longer than one winning streak. Of course, none of this guarantees what happens next. Tennis is brutally difficult. One week can bring a breakthrough. The next can bring an early loss. A player can rise quickly and then discover how difficult it is to stay at the top. That's why the next stage of Eala's journey matters so much. If she keeps improving her ranking while maintaining this extraordinary audience connection, she could become something women's tennis is always searching for. A true crossover star. A player who matters on the court and attracts attention off it. A player whose matches become events. And perhaps most importantly, a player who brings new people into tennis. That may ultimately be Eala's biggest impact. Not simply winning another match. Not simply climbing another ranking position. But making someone who never cared about tennis before suddenly ask, when is Alex Eala playing? That question started appearing in Washington. It may now follow her wherever she goes. And if the crowds continue growing, the resale demand continues rising, and the Filipino support continues spreading across North America, tournament organizers may eventually have no choice but to recognize what the fans already know. Alex Eala is no longer just a player people are watching. She is becoming a player people are showing up for. And there is a huge difference between those two things, because rankings can tell you who is winning. Statistics can tell you how good a player is, but only the crowd can tell you how deeply a player has connected with people. Washington gave us a glimpse of that. The next tournaments will tell us whether it was the beginning of something much bigger. And if Alex Eala keeps winning, keeps improving, and keeps bringing entire communities with her, the biggest question in women's tennis may no longer be about how high she can climb in the ranking. It may be about how many people will want a ticket when she arrives. Because sometimes, a superstar isn't created when the rankings finally recognize them. Sometimes, the crowd recognizes them first. And right now, the crowd is speaking very loudly. Alex Eala has arrived. The only question left is how far this phenomenon can go.